which was still quite a ways off on the first day of rehearsals. And everyone was prepared for a certain amount of table work, I guess, or just script development work. But I had them up on their feet almost immediately, because I think that's where plays live. They live on their feet. So the relief, I think, for them in terms of getting up and actually embodying and kind of going, how am I moving through this space? Where am I trying to get to? What do I want to achieve? All of that was kind of what pulled us forwards. But yeah, the script development continued quite extensively through rehearsals, and that's challenging and terrifying for the actors, incredibly difficult for our design departments, because I mean, I think there's a number of costumes that were just never made it onto stage. And that was just something we had to hold really carefully. And that's a much more producing challenge than a directorial challenge in a way, because it's about, you know, fear always exists when you're making a show. It's this kind of weird, strange, unknown thing. And will you get there, and will it work, and how will it meet its audience? So just trying to ensure that there was as much practicality and solidity wherever possible. I sort of felt coming in, and I was saying earlier, that I got them on their feet really quickly, because I really just wanted to ensure that everything felt like it was practical and building up, and that there was security and certainty at a point where scenes might evolve and shift and just go through, everything really had to go through a filter of exploration in the room, and I guess entrusting the actors to frame as clearly and cogently as possible what was or wasn't working or helpful or useful for them, or where the opportunities might be to kind of. And it felt really important for the writers to hear a little bit more about some of the jumps where the actors couldn't quite join up a journey from. So I was, emotionally there, and now I'm here, which is just part and parcel of that kind of condensing exercise. So ensuring that those questions could be heard and acted upon, but also within that, then not wanting to kind of open Pandora's box and suddenly everything's up for grabs. We'd still be in rehearsals, having to say at points to the company, I understand that request, or I understand why that might want to shift along. That, do not touch. And it was kind of like playing five-dimensional chess at times, because there was stuff that I knew I was planting into the show as we moved through chronologically, scene by scene, that was relevant and necessary, and that would be returned to. And there was one conversation in the room about Mark's journey, the character Mark, and that he and DB arrive at high school and they've been friends and then kind of go their separate ways. And then suddenly he's back at the climax and it feels like there's a lot that's been jumped. And as a kind of cold read, Grant, I know, found that like quite a huge, how do I get from there to there? I knew, however, that there were going to be a couple of the camera sequences that we have in the show, and there's a sort of journey to an extent of those going from being kind of quite anonymously operated to then being really inhabited by characters. And I knew that it was just pure mechanics. Like, well, Grant's the only person who could like operate a camera in this bit, but I knew it meant that I was going to put DB and Mark back on stage together for a kind of tender emotional moment before hitting that last chunk of the play, and that would help Grant get to where he needs to. Yeah, kind of deploying all of that to ensure that they felt within it, and that worked, thank God. So sort of things like that, so those sorts of things to overcome, which are very much, that's really practical dramaturgy in a way. Another thing I said very often to the team in the process as well is, fundamentally Damien lives longer with the impact and the consequences of this work than any of us will. So although, I kind of feel like there's so much value in telling a queer story and getting to do it at this sort of scale. Other ones will come around at a certain point, whatever. But this is, this is Damien. So really wanting to take care around that. And also knowing that, you know, as the writer of the memoir and a first-time stage playwright, he's written radio plays and things, that, you know, there's a risk of something appearing like some kind of vanity project in a way, and wanting to ensure that we protected Damien from that, which entails always having, you know, kind of rigorous conversations about, okay, this means a lot to you. How can we ensure that it means as much to an audience attending? And a thing I kind of held really fast to was that although I'm certain a huge percentage of the audience will be people who know the book, the play has to stand on its own. So therefore kind of feeding in what is it we need to ensure that, as I say, people care. So that felt like a real responsibility. You know, a memoir gets to be this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. A play has to really fashion that into a kind of protagonist arc. I think that took a lot of soul-searching at points for Damien because, you know, some of the realizations that the character DB has during the play are actually realizations that Damien only had at the point of working on the play, so, you know, 10 years later. And his journalistic brain is sort of such that you kind of go, oh, but I didn't know that then, or I didn't, and you kind of go, well, you know, just sort of helping lead him towards kind of an acceptance that actually, while that might not make the play entirely like accurate in a documentary style, it made for the most compelling drama, and all had a truth in it. You know, it's sort of a kind of distilled sort of version of that truth. So yeah, so all of those sort of cares and concerns, and then class actually. And you know, I'm one of still comparatively few directors in the UK who was brought up on benefits, and ensuring that that was represented with care and sensitivity as opposed to some of the slightly glib, patronising ways that theatre can handle that. So that felt like a huge responsibility as well. And it's such a kind of vast dramaturgical challenge, turning a memoir into a play. An adaptation as a form and as a skill is, you know, I think a lot of people think adaptation is easy because, oh, there's already a book. It's much, much, much harder because you can't imagine your way out of dead ends. And I think hopefully part of what we've achieved with this production is a real sense of theatricality. And you could do a version of the show which is just, here's a thing, here's a thing, here's a thing, here's a thing. You know, the show is already about 2 hours 45, I think. It's a whole life. I mean, it's 20 years, you know, of Damien's life. It would, yeah, it would run for days if you tried to dramatise all of that. So there has to be a kind of filtering mechanism. There has to be a motivation for why certain episodes, certain things are handled. And it felt really clear that the boys, as I call them, needed some support in that. So that's sort of why I ended up kind of hopping on. And the rest is history. Grant's name was on a list of CVs I was given to look at, and I sort of went, I think this energy feels right. I've never met him. He came in for a kind of workshop day, and he came in, and Damien grabbed me and said, he looks exactly like him. It's him. It's like he's, you know, and he has the energy and spirit of that person. So it's sort of, there have been so many little things like that. I mean, there were lots of different shades and levels to the casting journey. So there's a lot of doubling in the show necessarily, cast of 7 for, I think, about 40 different characters that appear. So looking for actors with that kind of technical versatility. And I think, you know, probably our greatest kind of representation of that within the company is the phenomenal Nicola Jo Cully, who plays Mum, and virtually everyone else at times. I mean, a few things. I believe in ensemble as a kind of principle, and I knew that given what the discussion in the rehearsal room would be and the responsibility of telling a kind of queer working class story well, I was just sort of subtly through the casting process, not kind of doing a kind of values check, but I was interested to open up that conversation as part of the process and see what that meant to people. Because, you know, sort of, it's not like I'm trying to lead people into war or whatever, but it's always, especially with new work, there's always going to be kind of gritting your teeth and like digging deep to get through to the finish line. So it felt important that everyone in the space really got that. And Damien was very generous about how the casting would work and understood that with the multi-rolling and such, like, people weren't necessarily going to be kind of perfect match, but he very much wanted to have, quite understandably, approval on the two actors playing the different hymns and mum and dad. Like, how is that family going to be represented? So he had some specific prompts and steers around, and I always kind of try to lead a writer more into talking about kind of energy and a certain quality as opposed to being like a direct physical carbon copy, because that's even less important in theatre than it would be in TV or film. And you know, so Grant he'd met and just, you know, like, he's Mark, and I knew from then working with him that he was going to leap into lots of different roles and bring, like, you know, Grant has performed in tons of musical theatre, so knew that he's going to bring a lot of additional skills into the room, and I didn't necessarily anticipate just how many song and dance numbers there were going to be at the outset, but I thought it might not be a bad idea to have that available. And it was really interesting in the casting of Gary as DB, who, the older DB, I think delivers one of the most extraordinary performances I've ever seen, really, and it's got so little to do with me, so it's been a privilege to see that develop and grow. And what Gary brought in as an actor was, you know, DB has these like massive epic speeches, and again, I think possibly because of the very toxic heteronormativity of our society, actors coming in who were giving us the kind of full Hamlet version of DB, and actually I think it feels very clear that Gary is at all times playing a gay man, and within that is accessing all of the kind of heights and depths of emotion and despair and tragedy and humour, dry wit and all of that, and that felt really important, that it felt like a gay man as hero, and Gary just brought that in with him. And I know Damien is sort of like, well, he's not as tall as I am, because, you know, Damien is gargantuan. And I was like, it doesn't matter. That's not what matters. And Damien was kind of willing to get on board with that. And then the next thing alongside that was ensuring that we DB kind of matched. And there was a moment where our absolutely excellent casting director, Orla O'Connor, brought in a load of WeDB options, and some of them were taller than Gary, and this is really, I was like, it's not going to work. That's not, because there's just that risk of it being a thing that pulls an audience out of the moment. You sort of go, so at what point did he shrink? And so I was like, I'm not going to just have him standing on a box throughout, am I? So that's where we got hyper specific. And Brilliant Sam, who I'd worked with before, is just brilliantly physical, has trained as a movement director in his own right. And I knew that my instinct was that part of the contrast between the two representations of DB would be one leading with his brain and the other leading with his body. So I was very keen to have Sam in the mix, and height played to my advantage, and I think the performances speak for themselves now. And then we found Beth, who, goodness me, just, I still can't describe it, what she does and how she does it so successfully, because it's not an impression, she's not dwarfed by it, there's total clarity of objective. She's bloody hilarious at points, and terrifying. I just knew, really. Obviously she's physically, as a, you know, flame-haired temptress, as I've called her before. You know, this is sort of a closer physical resemblance to Maggie than I had necessarily thought we needed, but it's just, I don't know. I mean, there's a bit where she comes in the grotto scene, she just storms in and starts talking about pubes. And I thought, this is just, I mean, massively camp, but held so seriously. So yeah, so, you know, Maggie felt very open, could have been anything, anyone, and I think we would have found a way to make that work. But ultimately we landed with the actor who was going to really nail for us a sense of what Maggie meant to Damien. Class, storytelling, queerness, as gay people were having to make do often with slivers of representation. I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess the power of words in literature, and I kind of touched on that at various points, which all kind of comes to a head in a way in the library sequence. DB's furious row with Maggie, which I think is in so many ways at the heart of the reason the play exists. So that's sort of stunningly important. It's sort of why Tim, our video designer, was really keen on just those words appearing all over the set. And this idea of the words that are used about people. You know, there's a sort of journey in some of that video content of like, from graffiti to print, which is just a very subtle, is it subtle? I don't know, way of kind of going, what might start off as name calling, if it becomes legitimised and becomes enshrined as law, like there's a journey, if we're not careful, of things that might seem childish to things that actively endanger people. This is a story about being able to find your voice and tell your story, and some of the most powerful content in the show thematically is around that, the idea of what stories are available to you, whose words, what does it mean if you don't have language about who you are available to you? How do you start to understand yourself? How do you start to like yourself, importantly? I think one of the most beautiful bits for me, every time I see it, is loosely constructed on the page, which is this sing-off between the DBs and Mary the Canary. And I was like, well, what's the story here? What are we trying to, how do we create stakes around this? And the way we've structured it, there's a really sentimental thing that happens, which is DB taking over the song and singing Stand By Your Man to his childhood self. And there's that thing about self-parenting that I think is part of how gay people survive. And that it felt really important to see DB under pressure step into a thing for his younger self. I think it felt fundamental in liking him, and liking him was so important to the, which is why, thank God, Gary said yes, because he just brought all of this gorgeous charisma with him. But there's a bit within that song sequence where Mary the Canary's dropped her gorgeous peignoir and gone into her big country and western number, and Sam picks it up and sort of swishing about with it. And that just sort of happened randomly, spontaneously. It wasn't a, I want you to do this now. But I'm pretty certain that there, by this point now, will have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gay men who've seen the show who have, you know, activates those memories of, yeah, finding a frilly bit of tat and pretending you're a pop star. And that, which is kind of drag in a way as well, that kind of DIY, take a thing, try to make something beautiful, try to assert your existence. So things like that are kind of all the way through the show. That equality is still a long way off, actually. I think we all need to acknowledge our complicity within structures of prejudice, because in so many ways we all do. So we don't scapegoat a Maggie entirely around that. Yeah, and that queer joy is super important.